have a terrific session for you, and to moderate that session, I want to introduce a friend of the conference who's returning. Liam Denning, who was with the Wall Street Journal, is now with Bloomberg Gadfly as the energy columnist and has spoken at Verde Exchange in past years, and today is moderating this important panel. If I could encourage you all to bring down the volume and bring your attention to the stage, I'd like Liam to introduce his distinguished panel and begin this session. Please welcome Liam Denning.
Hi, everyone. It's a real honor to be back here hosting this session, partly because it means I obviously didn't screw it up too much last time, and also because I have such a distinguished group of people on the stage with me. So I'm going to try and get through these very extensive bios as quickly as possible. I have condensed them quite a lot. So on my immediate left, there's Varun Sivaram. He is the Philip D. Reed Fellow for Science and Technology at the Council on Foreign Relations. And among his many other hats, he is a strategic advisor to New York's Governor Cuomo on the state's Reforming the Energy Vision program. And I should also mention at this point that he has a new book on solar energy coming out called Taming the Sun. So a little plug there. Next to him, we have Robert Weisenmiller. Bob was appointed by Governor Brown to chair the California Energy Commission in 2011, where he spearheads the state's efforts to reduce the environmental impacts of its energy use, while also reducing California's energy costs and ensuring reliable supply. Next to him, we have Catherine Rahis Boyd. She is president of the Western States Petroleum Association, which represents major oil and gas producers, refiners, and pipeline companies, as well as advanced alternative and renewable transportation fuels in the West. And finally, on the end there, we have William Funderburk. He's vice president of the Los Angeles Board of Water and Power Commissioners. He's also a founding partner of Castellon and Funderburk, a commercial litigation and advisory firm. He specializes in environmental litigation and compliance, and he oversees the Los Angeles office. So with that out of the way, we'll get straight down to it. In the spirit of the plenary, I'm going to be asking individual questions, but you should all feel free to weigh in as you please. So first question to Bob, and it will be the most obvious question. California has shown itself well able to set ambitious green energy targets and meet them early, and we're now at a point where people are asking whether there should be a target of 100% renewable power, a question which would have seemed completely infeasible 10 years ago. So is it feasible?
I think the big question first is that the right target, and then how do we get there, assuming it is? In terms of, if you look at California's greenhouse gas emissions, as Mary said, we've got about 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation. At the same time, we have phenomenal problems with fire in the state. Basically, our forest has gone from being a sink to a source for greenhouse gas emissions. Pretty clear that those are our top two priorities to address. Now, when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, again, power sector is about 20%. Of that, about half of it in-state, half of it out-of-state. That half is basically out-of-state, is much more carbon intensive. So having said that, assuming we can get through what the priorities are, we're going to get to 100% renewable at some stage. That's pretty clear. But to get there in a coherent fashion in terms of cost effective, we have to get to a regional market. And that's something which we've, as Mary and folks talked about in the last panel, we've had some stumbles the last couple of years. And at this point, we're in competition. It's either going to be Folsom or it's going to be Little Rock, or even Pennsylvania is really going to be the driver for the Western grid. And so we really need to get there to go to 100% renewable in any sort of cost-effective fashion. We're also going to need a lot of development of different types of storage, much longer-term storage than the few hours we have at this point. So there's a lot of foundational stuff we're going to need to get to 100%. We're going to do it, but I submit that what we really need to do at this point is double down, which we did last Friday, on basically the zero-emission vehicles and double down on trying to deal with the public lands. Go.
Yeah, you got it? You want to, what's your reaction?
Here's where we are at LADWP, and let me start generally and then get down to the specifics. For us, it's been about leadership and pushing innovation and technology, and that began when we were at renewables of 3 to 7% as recently as 2003, and then with the leadership of subsequent mayors. I'm not going to let Mayor Eric Garcetti, who appointed me to help reform DWP, take all the credit, although I think he deserves a lot. I think a lot goes to all of our predecessors from the leadership standpoint. The prior mayor got us off of, or pushed us forward to getting us off of coal. The prior mayor also pushed us forward on the renewable track, and we're now well over our targets for renewables. So in terms of the 100% number, we are moving forward to it. We're trying to meet the directive of both the City Council and the Mayor, and also in the absence of the leadership in Washington, which everybody talked about on the prior panel, on June the 20th, LADWP, June the 20th of 2017, LADWP went forward and reaffirmed that it is going to proceed with supporting the Paris Climate Accord in the absence of everything that's going on in Washington, D.C. So the push to renewables is going to continue forward. It's going to continue forward in a way that makes economic sense, is balanced. In terms of the fuel mix, I think we'll talk about that a little later, but we're fairly agnostic on fuel mix, although we would like to see renewables pushed to the extent that they can for the benefit of our ratepayers.
Varun, I think you had something to say as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think 100% renewables is a very good goal to set. Before I explain why, let me just give some of the foundational background for what we're trying to do here. The overarching goal for the country was laid out by President Obama. It's called deep decarbonization. The goal is an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. All developed countries need to do this for the world to stay on a trajectory that limits catastrophic climate change. 3/4 of the greenhouse gas reductions from that mark, 80% reduction by 2050, must come from a low-carbon energy transition. The rest come from things like land use change. Within that low-carbon energy transition, 60% of the gains need to come from decarbonizing electricity and electrifying the end uses of electricity, be they vehicles, heating, industry. And so when we talk about the electricity sector, I first want to say we are only talking about 33% of the progress we need to make by 2050. Nevertheless, this is the plurality of the progress we have to make. Now, zooming into electricity, do we want to have 100% renewables? Likely, almost surely not. By 2050, if we want to entirely decarbonize the electricity sector, which is a prerequisite for meeting our 80% greenhouse gas reduction goal, we're probably going to need 3 different kinds of resources. Several decarbonization studies have found that the lowest cost way is to have 3 kinds of resources. The first is variable intermittent renewables, wind and solar, for example, and that might account for somewhere above 50% of the mix. Certainly not 100, but probably above 50. So we're somewhere between 50 and 100. We kind of know how to get to 60%. We could even get to 80% with some serious investments in transmission. The second category is known as flexible base. This comes out of research at MIT, where they found that rather than have conventional baseload that tends to stay on all the time, you have baseload that's modern. It's got a high capacity factor, but it can ramp up and down to compensate for variable intermittent renewables. That includes nuclear. That includes gas, combined cycle gas turbines. And the third kind of resource is fast rampers. This helps to buffer the intermittency of solar and wind on a very short time scale. Could be demand response, could be storage in the form of batteries, and it could be natural gas combustion turbines. All three of these resources are going to be needed. It's almost certainly the case that renewables should be somewhere between 50 and 80%, but not 100, and we're going to need all of the other resources as well. So I'll pause there, but there's lots more to say on this. I don't think 100% renewables is a good target. It's certainly not going to happen. And even if the idea is to set a really bold target and try and get toward there, the illusion that 100% renewables is a good idea could cause us to close off options such as nuclear energy or carbon capture and sequestration. We cannot afford to close off any of these given how difficult the ultimate goal is.
Thanks. Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Liam, and I appreciate those comments very much. I think what I'd like to also introduce into this conversation of sort of the optimal energy mix, whether we're talking about electricity or transportation fuels, is to really remind ourselves and ask ourselves, how do you answer that question? And what are the real key criteria that one needs to think about as we figure out this really complex optimal energy mix? And so as we've looked at that as an industry, and we have to acknowledge that however the energy shift occurs, we want to be part of that conversation. It is one of the most innovative, creative industries I have ever seen, and I've worked with them for over 30 years. But there's really four pillars that I think help this conversation, and I think you'll see play out in the other excellent agenda items that the Verde Exchange has put together. I think it's the best conference that I've ever seen when I have to choose between different sessions that I can't pick, so I really appreciate what Verde has done here. But those four pillars are really energy equality, making sure whatever choices, whatever policies we begin to talk about in electricity or transportation fuels really allow access to reliable energy for as many people as possible, whether that's even people in disadvantaged communities. It really is access to everyone, whichever policy we choose, or whichever mix of policies. The second, of course, we talked about is the environment. I'm very happy to hear that Chairwoman Nichols does not see our death yet as the petroleum industry. And so it's really important that we talk about the environmental side. We have to, whatever policy, not only have access to everyone, but we have to have policies that deliver clean water, clean air, climate change goals. The third one is sort of the economic pillar. And it is equally as important as the other two. There have to be discussions about which of these policies or which mix of policies, how does that impact the ability of families and communities to have upward mobility, to provide for their kids' college, to put a roof over their heads. So those three pillars are really important for the fourth, which is how does the energy mix, how do they relate to one another? Renewables certainly are exciting, but they need innovation to become scalable. We need to have a part in that conversation. I've got members, we used to have, in our discussions with our utility friends, we used to have very, very distinct swim lanes. They did electricity, we did transportation fuels. We're all over each other's swim lanes now, which is a very positive, good thing. It's very cross-functional. I have members who are investing in electric charging station. I have huge R&D going into lithium-ion battery exchanges for electric vehicles. The industry is looking at all of those things, and I think it was even the recent California Council on Science and Technology report that just came out and really emphasized the need for this diversified energy portfolio and all of the above sort of strategy. So it's not a demise of anything. It's how does that energy mix answer those four questions? And if we do, we will have the most sustainable energy future going forward for electricity or for transportation fuels.
Thank you. Just keying off that and something that Varun brought up, the US has 2 nuclear reactors currently under construction. They may well be the last ones ever built in this country. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
There are two bad things going on in nuclear right now. One is that plants are slated for closure, and the second is that few plants are being built. Let me take them one at a time. Here's an astonishing fact. In the study that demonstrated that we could get to 80% renewables, this is a Nature Climate Change study from 2016, the amount of flexible dispatchable capacity that's needed to buffer the intermittency of renewables is about equivalent to all of our existing nuclear reactors. In other words, if we keep all of our nuclear reactors online, we could get conceivably to an 80% renewable future with significant investments in long-distance transmission.
Zero carbon, you mean?
What did I say?
Renewable.
Yeah, no, to an 80% renewable future
Oh, I see.
and a 100% zero carbon future. We could achieve that with today's nuclear fleet. That's astonishing. So it's a terrible thing that we are closing down nuclear reactors. I'll give you a quick stat. In 2014, when the Vermont Yankee plant closed, it halted 5 consecutive years of carbon dioxide cuts in New England and increased carbon dioxide from power of 5%. And right now, the Pilgrim plant in Massachusetts is around the same size, a little bigger, and is, on the brink of closure. Not good. You also asked about the lack of new construction. That's also not great, but I think you're telegraphing that you and I are probably on the same page that new nuclear reactors probably won't be built in this country, or very few of them will be built. And that is a symptom of the extraordinarily high capital cost of constructing Generation 3, or the current generation of nuclear plants, these light water reactors. That's why I believe that in nuclear, energy innovation is very important. We're going to need small modular reactors that are quicker to build and require less capital. We're going to need Generation 4 nuclear reactors that are modular. You can prefabricate components in factories, ship them all over the country. We're going to need new designs if we're going to revitalize our nuclear fleet. Without that, we won't build new nuclear reactors, and we'll start to close down existing ones. All of that will make a low-carbon transition almost impossible.
Thank you. Anyone else care to weigh in on that?
Yeah, in California, we have something called the loading order, where we focus our investment in resource development. And that's because you really can't do everything. That's the bottom line. So, it's like energy efficiency is the top of the loading order. I think in terms of cost, in terms of environmental impacts, you really have to go all out there. Renewables are second. And certainly when you get to nuclear and coal, they're sort of at the bottom. We've had fairly, I'll say, bad luck in California on the nuclear adventure. We've certainly had, Humboldt was one of the first. That's gone. That we have our sort of seismic issues in California, which certainly complicate the reactor design. But and Diablo Canyon is now, that's also going to be shut down. And that's going to be shut down because it's not economic. As you add more and more renewables to your resource mix, you're reducing wholesale prices. And that puts a challenge, and certainly, no one has thought of trying to have Diablo Canyon load follow. It wasn't designed to load follow. God knows how safe or unsafe it would be if it were load following. But, again, I think we need to be looking forward. Certainly it would be nice, say, if nuclear plants were cost effective and flexible. Perhaps the new technology would work. But we put a lot of money into nuclear in this country compared to the amount of money we put into solar or wind or a smart grid. God bless, if we could get CCS to work, that would be fantastic. Particularly on a global scale. But again, there's been a lot of attempts for CCS which have just not worked. And the question is, what's the right mix? And I would submit California is much more forward-looking on where we're heading. And certainly, you have to keep, you have to have some sort of loading order of how you're going to spend your money and make sure you focus on what's most needed.
Catherine.
I'm certainly not a nuclear expert by any means, but to some of Varm's points, when I look at a place like France, right? They have some of the most aggressive climate change goals in the country, and a lot of it is achieved through their nuclear program. Germany certainly moved away from that from recent disasters, and they went more to coal, and so their greenhouse gas emissions have increased. So I just go back again to, sometimes certain energy falls out of favor, and then certain government policies send signals to the marketplace, and there's a reaction. That doesn't necessarily mean that that decision took into account all four of those pillars that I talked about. So again, it's whatever choice we make, does it accomplish those four things? Now, it would never necessarily do it equally, and there's choices obviously to be made. But even at 100% renewable, when you look at that target, it certainly may not increase reliability and decrease cost, which is just part of that equation, part of that pillar, but it may do other things that in the conversation, in the inclusive conversation, one thing I love about Verdi is it has an inclusive, intentional conversation, that those things can be weighed and that right mix and sustainable future can be achieved. So I think nuclear is still an important piece of that puzzle, and we'll just see where it goes.
Okay. I think actually we need to move on from power. We need to talk about transportation, obviously, because that's such a large part of the greenhouse gas emissions in California. We've obviously had the recent executive order from Governor Brown, and that is helpful, but what will it actually take to make electric vehicles go mainstream, either in California, in the US, in the wider world? Maybe, Bob, we could start with you.
Well, one of the interesting statistics is California has 40% of the zero-emission vehicles in the U.S. Having said that, it's a very small part of our fleet, 340,000 cars roughly. Certainly some other vehicles, but so it's a big lift. Now, I think when you talk to Mary and the research that we've done, part of it is obviously the knowledge is there. It's always amazing the number of people who don't know that you could go in and you could buy an electric vehicle. The other part is infrastructure. And in the executive order, that's certainly the Energy Commission's responsibility. And what the executive order did was say, okay, we're going to make a commitment over the long term, both for the rebates and for the infrastructure, so that people can get comfortable that, if they're buying an electric car, that they're going to find a charger, or if they're buying, a hydrogen vehicle, they can get to fueling. And part of it is, again, when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, as we said, 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions, including the refineries, is from transportation. Over 80% of our pollution is from transportation. That's got to be a very high priority, and certainly the governor has staked it as a very high priority that we have to figure out how to make that work. And as you know, one of the real drivers is China. Certainly, given the air quality issues in China, they are placing a very big bet on electric vehicles as something they have to do. It also deals presumably with the strategic implications of their petroleum reliance. But, they have more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined at this stage, and they have very aggressive goals. And I think the U.S. OEMs, like GM sells more cars in China than they do in the U.S. So it's really forcing the automotive industry to really step up its game on innovation there. So it's certainly going to take innovation. It's certainly the whole charging. How do we get faster charging? How do we get better batteries? But I think combination of California and China and others in this area can help drive the innovation we're going to need to really tackle what's a very fundamental problem for us in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. So it's one of those things where we really have to transform that industry, and that's got to be at the top of our priority list.
Catherine, I had a feeling you would want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, and I appreciate Bob's comments because he very much talked about the challenge. And for a place like California, and I think we all know that we're the third largest transportation consuming entity in the world, and the only two in front of us are the United States of America and China. So it's, 97% of what we fuel our transportation with here in the state is from petroleum. That being said, there are very aggressive goals out there for electric vehicles, for electric vehicle infrastructure. A lot of the cap and trade auction revenues will be, as the governor stated, will be directed in that area to spur innovation. But you know, you have 26 million internal combustion engines and 340,000 electric vehicles. So there is a lot of discussion, and I appreciate Senator Wajkowski's comments in the previous panel about, you know, he's got to figure out what does it take to do that. You know, how does that actually have to happen if that were the goal of the state, that is the goal of the state of California? You know, how does that happen? What does that look like? And then again, what are the policies that, again, while we're talking about that, ensure that we have accessible energy, that it is hitting our goals, our environmental goals, and that it is also taking into account the economy side of that equation. And then we can't forget the consumer. Consumer choice is what really drives any innovation, and so it's really important to, I mean, they are the biggest part of this equation into how fast the electric vehicles begin to become more of that energy mix. So, and you know, in the interim, we still have to make everything we're doing in our business the cleanest, safest possible. I mean, Bob knows we've been through 3 gasoline reformulations. I mean, it's the cleanest gasoline on the planet, and we're working to make it cleaner. Of course, on the gasoline side, it's tough because you have ethanol blend wall. You can't put 10% more than 10% ethanol in there, and so it really matters the type of ethanol you put in, and there's a lot of innovation going on there. And on the diesel side, a lot of progress on biodiesel, renewable diesel. So, you know, we've got to still make the 26 million internal combustion engines that are utilizing our products as clean and affordable and reliable as possible, so that that ultimate energy mix and whatever it is, and that can answer those 4 pillars, delivers this sustainable future.
Thank you. William.
Yeah, let me bring up a couple of things, and first at the higher level. When I was in Bonn, what I was struck by was the emphasis not just on the haves, but on the have-nots. It was the Bonn Fiji conference that Bonn was hosting for the island nation of Fiji. And with that as a lens to look at things through, we at DWP, before the governor's executive order and leadership, took the role last spring of increasing our budget. It was brought to us by staff to increase the number of electric vehicle chargers. So this goes to infrastructure. And this goes to the importance of investing in research and technology. It was brought to us by staff to increase the number of electric vehicle chargers by 3 times. I asked for 10 times, thinking maybe we'll settle on 5. And I asked for an alternatives analysis. By the end of the budget discussions, by May, it was 10 times. I should have asked for 20. But clearly, the power is there at places like Department of Water and Power to make these investments. It's sometimes a very big elephant in the room, but when it moves, it can move very quickly. And in doing the electric vehicle chargers, they're going to be done equitably, and they won't just be in places like Bel Air or Sherman Oaks or my neighborhood near Hancock Park. They'll be in Watts, Pacoima, Panorama City, et cetera. So that will be through an equity lens, which I'm going to talk about later on today, but I just thought that I'd bring that up because I think that goes to Kathy's point about doing things in an equitable way, looking at workforce not just as green jobs, but also making sure that as we move to more renewables and we move to more storage to offset the intermittency, we also do so in an equitable way. So.
Well, that actually tees up the next question I was going to ask, which is kind of flipping this on its head a little. Any industry that's undergoing a fundamental change creates winners, but it also tends to create losers in the short term. You only have to look at what web-based advertising has done to my industry. for instance. As we progress through the energy transition, there are obviously going to be costs in the form of potentially stranded assets, disruption in financial markets, disruption to jobs, communities. These are all things that have obviously come into a great deal of focus, particularly since the election in 2016. So how do we deal with that other side of the equation, bridging those short-term costs as we reach for a longer-term goal? And I'd open that to anyone.
Can I speak up on that?
Please.
Last night at the Japanese consulate, we had an interesting discussion about the role that markets are going to play in the free markets. The movie Wall Street was brought up. For those of you who are old enough to remember what it was, with the Academy Awards coming up, with Gordon Gekko and Greed is Good. There's also another side to that coin. Martin Sheen played the union rep, and not that I'm a big union person, but there's something that gets lost in this equation. There's a 90-year-old woman who grew up in coal country, who lives in Reseda, who is waiting, fearing her DWP bill that might go up by $1 because she's living on fixed income. Well, in the Wall Street movie, Martin Sheen says, "There came from Egypt a pharaoh who does not know." And Gordon Gekko says, "What is that? A proverb?" And Martin Sheen says, "No, it's a prophecy. The rich have been ripping off the poor forever, and they've been doing it for decades, if not centuries and millennia. And what they're doing is no different. The only difference today is that the pyramids and the Egyptians didn't have unions, and whereas the Empire State Building, there are." So again, I'm not pro-union or anything, but I think that things need to be looked at through that equity lens. We need to think about the people who don't have. And I don't mean just the quote-unquote disadvantaged communities. I mean the people that this president is actually speaking to, the people who are poor, working class, and just need a leg up. So as the utilities move into the future, and we move with the workforce, and we move to renewables, and we move to these other things, they have to be balanced out.
I'll say that the energy transition offers our economy as well as many other economies on Earth the opportunity to create new jobs, to create new industries. And there are important public policy imperatives to give us a competitive edge, whether it's in the burgeoning renewable energy industry or the burgeoning grid services industry, electric vehicle industry, et cetera. The way not to do it, though, is what we heard about in the last panel, to impose trade barriers, tariffs. These are blunt instruments that will often exert more collateral damage than the good that they will do. In this particular case, we saw our president impose trade barriers on solar panels. It's not going to help bring back manufacturing to the United States. But there is a remarkable opportunity for the United States to carve itself out a niche as a major producer of new energy. We are currently the world's leading producer of old energy, oil and gas. I would contend, by the way, that's a great thing, but maybe a different discussion. In a new world, in a new energy transition, we could be the world's leading producer of solar products, but that's not going to happen with trade barriers. Rather, it's going to happen through innovation. And that's what I talk about in my book. I argued that in the United States, our comparative advantage is not to manufacture commodities at scale, like what China does through its centrally planned industrial economy. It's rather to harness our innovation economy and manufacture technologically superior products and improve them faster than others can copy them. And in the field of solar, which I write about, there are fascinating technologies on the lab bench right now. For example, ways to inkjet print rolls of lightweight, flexible solar coatings that we could commercialize in this country with the requisite public investment in research, development, demonstration, and manufacturing. So that's what we should be doing to create jobs in the United States, because otherwise we're going to cede that ground to other countries that frankly will make technologically inferior products.
No, certainly on a policy level, it's very important that all Californians can benefit from the clean technology revolution. And to do that, it's got to be a key part of our policy. There's got to be basically training programs. I remember when I was being sworn in, at that stage, it was after the housing crash. And, you know, there's a fascinating article in the Washington Post about how, I think it was Fresno was the location, but there was phenomenal unemployment in construction workers. At the same time, jobs in medical services were begging for people to apply. Now, obviously, construction workers can't go in directly, but you have to have a training program, and I think people have to anticipate that, you know, we're in such a transformative era where it's unlikely someone's going to work for 50 years in the same job. So you have to have the training programs to really follow those. And one of the real opportunities we've been trying to focus on too is California has led the world in many respects in the clean technology revolution. And we've acted as a showcase on what you can do, but we also need to reach out. It's an opportunity both for jobs in California and businesses in California to grow, but also just the reality is California is only 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So unless we can reach out to China, unless we can reach out to the rest of the western states, we're not going to achieve the problem we're working on. But it's very important to stay focused on the human element as we go through these transformations.
Catherine.
Yeah, Liam, and you know, I keep hearing the word energy transition, and I'm not a big subscriber to that word because it implies that you're going away from something to something, and it can imply winners and losers, winners and losers. And I would rather talk about it in the terms of energy leadership in the space of oil and gas and renewables coming together. And I say that because it's important when you look at what that prediction is even now from the Energy Information Administration, the arm of DOE that projects out in the future. In 2040, they still project our energy needs being met by 30%, it's 30% gas, or 30% oil, 25% natural gas, 20% coal, 7% nuclear, and 4% in wind, solar, and bio. And so we have to really talk about how we come together and what that mix looks like. And I also want to just note on the job side, because I think, the optimal job mix will depend on what the optimal energy mix is, and that'll depend on those questions that I posed. But for this industry, I mean, we employ 370,000 people in the state of California and $111 billion in revenues. LADC has done some great work for us on just looking at what the oil and gas industry contributes to the state in various localities. And it's a pretty diverse workforce, not only in ethnicity, but also in gender. And it also is really high-paying wages. And so, as we look at the energy mix, some are not as high-paying wages. And so we can't forget about the people who are employed in these jobs and what this shift or mix looks like relative to their ability to continue to have upward mobility and to contribute to the communities in which they live and to fuel the communities and the economies in which they live. So and I just want to put that on I don't look at it as a transition as much as I do an inclusive conversation for a sustainable future that allows access to reliable fuels, that meets our environmental goals, that allows us to really think about the economic side of that equation, and then to bring it all together in something that really works to go forward.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on because we are out of time. So it just remains for me to say thank you to our panelists. And if you could please give a big round of applause for Varun, Bob, Catherine, William.